Hi guys, hello and welcome to another Java programming video. In this video, we will be solving problem number 3 that was given to you in the Java final exam. In this problem, you were asked to accept a year from user and then display if it's a leap year or not. A lot of you took the approach where you tried to completely divide a number by 4. And if it was completely divisible, you said, well, it's a leap year. Otherwise, you said it's not a leap year. Well, that's a partial solution because I did give you that instruction in the final exam that you also need to check for the century year, because the century years like the years 1600, 1700, 1800, 1900, 2000, 2100, the century years must be completely divisible by 400 to be considered a leap year. So that's something that you have to keep in mind when you're solving this problem. Just merely checking to see if it is completely divisible by 4 is not enough. So let's get started. First of all, we need to make sure that we import the java.util.scanner so that we can accept an input from user. Therefore, we will be now instantiating the scanner object. We need a variable year to make sure that we are accepting a year from user. So we will ask user, please enter a year. Integer year equals to input dot next int. So far, the problem is very simple. It's based on the things that you learn in chapter 2 of the book, which is how you organize your import, how you accept an input from user and store it in a variable. Now comes the actual challenge. First of all, we will make sure that if the entered year is completely divisible by 4. Now, how do you check for completely divisible? If you remember, this percentage looking operator is actually called modulus operator. Modulus operator performs the division and gives you the remainder, not the quotient. So what we're basically checking to see if year, when divided by 4, gives 0 as a remainder, that means it's completely divisible, then it's a leap year. Otherwise, it's not a leap year. Now, that would be a very simple solution if the century year was not part of the process. So we will be further solving the if condition. But let me first complete the else, which is very simple. If the year is not completely divisible by 4, then we can easily tell the user that it is not a leap year. Or if you want to also display the year, you can replace the word it with year. So-and-so is not a leap year. Now here comes the actual challenge. Now, if the year is completely divisible by 4, now we need to make sure, first of all, that it is not a century year. Why? There are certain century years like year 1900, which is completely divisible by 4, but year 1900 is not a leap year. The last leap year was the year 2000, and then before that it was year 1600. So leap years for century years come every 400 years. So the next century leap year would be the year 2400. So now, first of all, I would want to make sure that year is, if it's completely divisible by 100, that means it's a leap year. That means it's a century year. So now, if it's a century year, then I need to make sure that if it is completely divisible by 400. As you can see, the code got slightly complicated, but that I'm going a little bit slower for you to be able to understand the process. And feel free to pause the video to catch up with the code. So anyway, now let's recap what we just did here. If the year is completely divisible by 4, okay, then we will check to see if it is a century year. If it's a century year, then we would want to make sure that if it is completely divisible by 400. So these are my 3 breakdowns. So if it is a century year, if it is completely divisible by 4, and if it's a century year, and if it is completely divisible by 400, then I know for sure that it is a leap year. So for example, if it's a number which is not completely divisible by 4, then you wouldn't even have to worry about if it's a century year or not. You only need to worry about if it's a century year or not is when it is completely divisible by 4, then you want to make sure if it's a century year or not. If it's not a century year, so for example, if it is not, so if the number is not completely divisible by 100, then it's a clear-cut answer that it is a leap year. So if a number is completely divisible by 4 and it is not a century year, then it's a clear-cut answer. It's a leap year. But if it's a century year and it is not completely divisible by 400, then it is not a leap year. So just so that you can see, this is the whole structure for the completely divisible by 4. Again, if it is completely divisible by 4, then we need to check to see if it is a century year. If it is not a century year, then right away we will jump to this else, which will state that it is a leap year. If it is a century year, then we need to make sure if it is every 400 years. So if it is completely divisible by 400, only then it is a leap year, otherwise it's not a leap year. For example, year 1900. If I bring up my calculator, year 1900 is completely divisible by 4, but the year 1900 is not a leap year. So just because it's completely divisible by 4 doesn't automatically qualifies it to be a leap year if it's a century year. So that's why we are checking to make sure if it's a century year to see if it is completely divisible by 400. Now, for example, the year 1700 is also completely divisible by 4. So again, we need to make sure if it is completely divisible by 400, which isn't the case. Year 1800 is also completely divisible by 4, but it was also not a leap year. So all of these century years needs to be dealt with a little bit differently. So now let's run this program to check how the program is working. So let me bring up this, okay? Please enter a year. So let me enter year 1900. It says 1900 is not a leap year, and that's how it should have been. Now let me enter the year 2000, and it says it is a leap year. Now let me enter the year 2023, not a leap year. Okay, how about 2024, leap year? So I tested for all conditions, where I tested for century years, I tested for non-century years, and I tested for century years, which is a leap year, century year, which is not a leap year, non-century year, which is a leap year, non-century year, which is not a leap year. So that's how we have tested it. So if it is not completely divisible by 4, then right away it will jump to this else down below. So you have to make sure in this code that your curly braces are balanced. That's very, very important. So anyway, make sure after you're done writing this code, you test it. You can pause it to be able to complete the code, and then try to look for syntax errors, and I'm pretty sure you will be able to run this on your own and be able to display the final output. Don't forget to close and balance all the curly braces. So there's a closing for the main, there's a closing for the class, there's a closing for the else, there's a closing for the if. So make sure all the curly braces are balanced all the way across. Same goes for the double quotes. All the lines that needs to have a semicolon must have a semicolon. You do not need to put a semicolon in the line of the if condition or the else. So keep that in mind. Of course, this problem can also be solved using other approaches. So as long as you have solved this problem correctly, that for all the inputs that I gave in my test runs, if you can get the same output as I did, then again, you know, the same problem could have different solutions. As long as it works, it is good. You do not need to have the exact same way of writing this code, but as long as the inputs yield the correct output, then you are probably fine. Anyway, till next time, take care of yourself.